Great. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate everyone taking the time out of their busy schedules, and it's nice to be back together after so long. I hope everyone has survived lockdown and no one has gone crazy. Just before we start, I think it might be valuable if we could just quickly go down the list of everyone who's in attendance today and just quickly your name, where you're from, and why you wanted to attend today. It's always reassuring to know who you're speaking with. So if you don't mind, I'm going to go down the list as I have it in alphabetical order. Adika, you're first. I also have your name twice. Are you there? Okay. Alex?
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Alexandra Maurtua, and I've worked for Community Insights Group. And I'm very happy to participate today to catch up on latest case studies about the phase 2, and we'll be presenting a little bit later as well. Happy to see everybody online.
Great, thanks, Alex. Bongani? Bongani, you will need to unmute yourself, the phrase of 2020.
All right. Okay. Am I unmuted now?
Yes.
To think that I've just come from another meeting and I still had the same problem. But thank you very much for having us here. It's Bongani from Environmental Impact Management Services. And I think it's good to catch up, and I'm pretty much interested in the topic as well, like just the update on the standard, and to see maybe any new things that I need to understand and how I can apply it further. Otherwise, thank you very much.
Wonderful, Bongani. Thank you. Great to have you. Brent?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Brent Holm. I'm the Environmental Practice Leader for Marsh. And I think I'm on here just to get a better understanding of the performance 2 and to get our name out there. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for joining, Brent. It's great to have you. Bronwyn, I don't know if you're connected. Can you hear me? No? Cheyenne? Sure. A lot of very shy people on this call. Dami? I know Dami is there. No? Wow. Okay. Wow. Slim pickings today. Cheyenne says it won't allow me to connect. Okay, Cheyenne, try dial in and out again. You need to make sure before you do that, just make sure your audio is connected, because you've connected to the call. At the top, there's an audio connection in the drop down. Check audio connection, and it should allow you to dial in with your computer. Let me know if you don't come right. Francois?
Hi everyone, Francois Barnard. Yeah, for today, the main reason I'm trying to learn additional to the audits and EDs that we can do.
Great, Francois, I really appreciate you joining. Thanks, and good to have you. Jessica?
Hi all, I'm from SOK Consulting. I'm a social scientist, and the same as Francois, just want to learn a bit more, especially in terms of the due diligence work that we do in the audits.
Great, thanks for joining, Jessica. Really great to have you. Lisa?
Hi all, Lisa Mallow here from JCM Power. From the client side. So really looking forward to delving deeper into IFC Performance Standard 2, and particularly how it relates to our projects as a company.
Great, thanks. Malcolm?
Hi everyone, Malcolm, Trusted Partners, helping Ben out on the IFC program, and we're talking a little bit about experiences in the IFC PS2 later today.
Thanks, Malcolm. Mampiti? Mampiti, are you there? Final call? I feel like a bit of a school teacher calling people out now. Okay, Makonjo, I know you probably just joined. Are you there?
I am.
Would you like to? Mampiti, okay, Mampiti, go first, please.
Hi, everyone. Mampiti from Savannah. I'm happy to be here today just to catch up with everyone and to learn. Social distancing has been very, very, very brutal. So I'm very happy just to see some other faces. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for being so honest, Mampiti. Makonjo?
Hi, Ben. How are you? I am Mekonjo Erastus from Monasa Advisory and Associates, all the way from Namibia. And yeah, I'm just here to learn as well.
Thanks, Makonjo. I know Niraj is only joining later. Teboho?
Good morning, everybody. I'm Teboho from EIMS. I'll be supporting Malcolm in sharing some of the PS2 experiences, both from the auditor's perspective as well as an implementer's perspective, having worked for contractors and supervising engineers. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Teboho. Really appreciate you taking the time to present. You and Malcolm are the only consultants presenting today, so I feel really honored. Who else? Tshepo? Hello, Tshepo, we can't hear you. No, Tshepo, we can't hear you. Maybe a little bit in the background. Okay, I can't hear you, Tshepo. I think we'll just move on. I think Tshepo, Bronwyn, and Cheyenne are having difficulties connecting, and I think if you can see me but you can't hear me, it's to do with your audio. In the top bar, there's an audio button. If you then go speaker, microphone, and camera, or audio connection, one of those two, you should come right. If you then really struggle, you can also try download the webex app on your phone or iPad. If you have any issues, I can try call you after my initial presentation after I've handed over to Malcolm and Teboho. Yeah. Okay, guys, let me share my screen. The way today is going to work is I'm going to kick the session off by providing an introduction to Performance Standard 2. Really, the focus of the presentation is actually the contents of the Performance Standard and just covering the basics. And then I'm going to hand over to Malcolm and Teboho for them to take us through some of their on-the-ground practical experiences of applying Performance Standard 2. And then we're going to try something I've never done before, but we're all going to try and do a quiz on Performance Standard 2 on SurveyMonkey. So I will share the list with you, the link with you in advance. But make sure everyone's been warned. Then we'll have a 15-minute break, and then I'm going to hand over to Niraj, who's one of my IFC colleagues based in Nairobi, to speak about the recently published best practice guidance note on gender-based violence, and then also to Alex, who's going to speak about the INGA social and human country context tools that was recently published by her consultancy for Community Insights. And then we'll have a bit of a Q&A and a discussion of next steps. Guys, I can't mute all of you. If you are not speaking, please can you make sure you just mute yourself? Thank you so much. Okay, I also want this to be an interactive session. Please raise your hand if you have any questions, or yeah, just interrupt me if there are any pressing issues. I think 90% of you guys know each other, so we're all friends here, and I would like just to hear from you guys. The idea of the series that we're kicking off today on the performance standards is really to recover the basics, but I really want to emphasize peer learning opportunities. So if you have any experiences or issues or questions that you would like to share as we are talking, please just raise your hand or jump in. I'll try and pause regularly for questions as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and kick off this session by talking about IFC PS2. We're going to do a bit of an overview, and we're going to discuss kind of how you look at DD issues associated with PS2 when you're on site. So really, I just want to quickly recap kind of what the objectives of PS2 are. So they're really very focused on fair treatment, non-discrimination and equal opportunity in the workforce, formalized worker management relationships, so good HR policies, practices and procedures, compliance with national law, and protection of vulnerable categories of workers. So we're talking about migrant workers, child labor, third-party workers, and workers in the supply chain. We're also looking at issues associated with health and safety. So they're the sort of key objectives of the Performance Standard 2. I think it's important to highlight that in South Africa, we have very, very strong and well-enforced labor laws. As we all probably know, unions are also very active in this country. So what we find is Performance Standard 2 and the sort of philosophy behind Performance Standard 2 and the South African legislation are very much aligned. Actually, in some cases, you'll find that the requirements of national legislation in South Africa are more stringent than those of Performance Standard 2. And I know that is something that Malcolm is going to focus on specifically. So really, I wanted to sort of challenge you to see, are there any projects that any of you have worked on where IFC Performance Standard 2 has not been applicable? In my experience, every single project that I've worked on, Performance Standard 2 has applied. And likewise for IFC Performance Standard 1. Anyone brave have any examples of PS1, PS2 projects where PS2 did not apply? Stony silence. Okay. I don't think there are any. I mean, for a variety of projects, you're still going to be looking at PS2 for a greenfield office block project where there may not be workers yet, but you're going to still be looking at PS2 issues associated with the construction work, and you're also going to be considering the people working in the building. Likewise, for operating a hospital, you're going to be very focused on the staff, and farming operations likewise. Okay, so if you read the Performance Standard 2, you'll see that it's really broken up into 4 key areas. key area number 1 is working conditions and management of worker relationships. So that is really your HR policies and procedures. Occupational health and safety issues are pretty clear. Then we're talking about protecting the workforce, worker rights, and then workers engaged by third parties and workers in the supply chain, and how to manage those types of issues. Okay, so working conditions and management of worker relationships is really the first part of any sort of project. So when you're going on site, it's really important that prior to any site visit, you try and gather in advance, as part of your information request, clear and understandable information on their HR policies and procedures. So the sort of things that you would look for prior to even going on site is, does the company have an HR handbook? Do they have written and documented contracts for their workers? And we need to see the different types of contracts that they have for their workers. So management, contracts they have with management versus contracts that they have with their staff versus contracts that they have with day laborers or short-term contractors. It's very important that you then go through those different contracts and make sure that they are meeting the requirements of the performance standard and national law. And another important consideration is, are they understandable to the people that they're employing? So without wanting to sound funny, a contract that you provide for a management level person is going to be much more sophisticated and nuanced than perhaps you would for a worker. Ditto in terms of the language. If you're working in rural Kenya on a wind farm project and you're providing contracts in English, it's not really going to be very effective where most people speak Swahili or another local language. So it's those types of considerations that are really, really important. Does anyone have any questions on sort of assessing HR policy and procedures, or any points that they would like to raise from their own experience? I'm really hoping to draw on everyone else's experience. Any tips that people might have around assessing these types of issues?
Ben, it's Malcolm here.
Malcolm, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think often from a practical perspective, companies often implement these, at least in South Africa, you're implementing performance standards on a project basis. And there's frequently a separation between your head office kind functions, perhaps sitting in Joburg or Cape Town, and the project itself, where the project site has been handed over to an EPC contractor. And in terms of legislative process, the client, as it were, would sign over the entire project to the EPC, who's then responsible for everything on site, including the management system. And these EPC contractors, they vary in capability, and the contractors, the civil contractors below them, vary in capability. And frequently, you'll find a very big disconnect between anything that's established in an HR department sitting in a smart office in Johannesburg to what's happening on site. I think that's something that one always needs to be cognizant of and take the effort and time to actually drill down into who is responsible for the environmental management system. Often it's the client, because the client is the one that's raised finance from the DFI or the private equity for the project. So there's got to be this link between various companies, the client's HR expectations, health safety expectations, the EPC, the handover of that and qualification of that in contractual requirements to the EPC, and then below the EPC, obviously to the contractor. So it can be, from a project construction perspective, quite challenging to actually get to the details.
Yeah, thanks, Malcolm. I really like that point. I mean, I think construction projects are very complicated because you have so many layers. You know, you can't just go and look at the contracts for the workers at head office of the developer. You need to also look at the contracts of the EPC workers, and also you need to try and see contracts of the subcontracted workers. So there are many different layers and many different issues that you can encounter. One issue that, from my personal experience, I've seen in a number of construction projects across the continent is that at a subcontractor level, you have a disparity in pay between, let's say, a bricklayer for a subcontractor and the bricklayer working for the contractor. So it creates a lot of different issues and tensions within the workforce. So that's something that really needs to be looked out for. Malcolm, anything else?
Yeah, just to further your point, typically you would have, let's call it the client, their staff and their people will be employed typically under the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, supported by the OSH Act. When you get down to the EPC, it's again, management level comes in under the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. But then under the OSH Act, you get the bargaining council agreements for the civil engineering sector. And that, attaches slightly different conditions and expectations, because it's a bargaining council agreement, or it's a sector agreement under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, which deals with labor in that particular sector. Now, it could be you could be aligning with the civil engineering bargaining sector. There's an electrical bargaining sector. There's one for security workers. There's one for farm workers. So one needs to be aware as to where these things fit in and what level in the overall project structure, from client through EPC to contractors, as to which apply where and how they're affected in contractual agreements with various parties.
Great, thanks, Malcolm. I mean, I agree. Also looking at collective bargaining agreements. I mean, we talk about that a bit separately, but again, something very important to consider. Would anyone else like to raise any of their shared experiences or share their experiences of working on PS2 types of issues?
Hi, Ben. It's Adika here.
Hi, Adika. Thanks for joining. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure.
So briefly, my experience with PS2, what I've noticed is that PS2 is not a one-size-fits-all, especially in terms of you have to consider the scale of operations as well as the maturity of your client. In the agricultural space, for example, your approach would vary when you're dealing with an emerging farmer versus a big commercial farmer. And this is just in terms of, how evolved their processes are, as well as the scale of the operations. And what we found is that with the emerging farmers, there's a lot more hand-holding required and capacity building around PS2. Whereas with your big commercial farmers and in agriculture, most of their production is export orientated. And what's good about that is that they have a number of certifications in place to be compliant to export, such as WITA and CISA. And those certifications actually check for labor and working conformance in terms of their management systems, as well as international best practice around working conditions, as well as legal compliance. So we do the DD if we hear that type of certifications. It gives us a bit of assurance that most of the requirements in PS2 would also be covered. So that's just what we look for. Thanks, Ben.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, Adika. Thank you. Really appreciate it. I think this issue around, clients, whether they're in the agri sector or a different type of sector, the level of sophistication, the size of the business, will often speak to the sort of the level of sophistication associated with the HR management systems. And I think one thing I often see is, DDs where the recommendations are expecting a small farm in rural Zambia to have the same sort of HR policies as a large commercial farm in South Africa, which is never ever going to be practical and sort of makes your report not as effective. So I always recommend considering the sort of size and capabilities of the business. And I think it's also kind of important to juggle the guidelines that are the IFC performance standards with what local legislation actually requires as a bare minimum for workers. So I think that trying to juggle those two things is quite a skill. Working conditions in terms of employment, collective bargaining agreements, migrant labor equality and accommodation. So I think it's very important prior to conducting a site visit again to understand the sort of engagement that the company has with unions and organized labor, what agreements they have in place, and then trying to find documentation that can prove that the agreements are being followed. I think it's also very valuable to try and interview workers, preferably without management being present, as well as reps from the unions and shop stewards, to understand what the relationship is between management and the workers. This is a very sensitive issue in South Africa and one that needs to be carefully investigated, but it is important to find out what the collective bargaining agreements are and if they're being followed. Migrant labor, I think we all think of migrant labor as sort of people traveling from one country to another, like from Zimbabwe to South Africa to find work and to work maybe on a construction site. But I think we also have a lot of migrant labor in South Africa. So I know currently there are a number of wind energy projects in the Cape where there is a significant influx of people, workers to the project from the rural Eastern Cape and living in these small towns and communities. So obviously there are a lot of performance standard 4 issues associated with that, and we can talk about that in a future session. But I think what is also very important is to make sure that any migrant workers is employed on similar terms to workers who are from the same place as the construction project. And worker accommodation, again, is a very contentious issue, especially when you have workers living on site. You have the contractor managing the worker accommodation. There is an IFC and EBRD guideline that was published a few years ago. It provides very detailed specifications for what constitutes best practice when it comes to worker accommodation. I will put the link to the guide in the chat box after my presentation. I would urge anybody who is conducting a site visit where worker accommodation is provided. Obviously, this is normally for construction projects and is temporary workers living in porta cabins and in dorms. I would really advise you to have a look. There's actually even a checklist in the annexure of what you need to look out for on a site visit. But it is very important that you don't overlook visiting accommodation on site. I've had experiences a number of times where management showing you around the site tries to sort of avoid you going to the accommodation for various reasons, but normally they say, well, it's obviously not part of the project's key operations, so it's not something that you need to concern yourself with, which is always a bit of a red flag, and would urge everyone to try and look at accommodation when they are going to sites with it. Would anyone like to share their experiences on working conditions and terms of employment around dealing with unions, dealing with migrant labor, looking at a worker accommodation? Any interesting issues or experiences?
Yeah, Ben, perhaps I can just throw in something there. I am going to talk a little bit about that shortly. But I think, when looking at accommodation, we had some good experiences in Egypt a year or so back, where the project was located in the south of Egypt, which is culturally very different to the north of Egypt, where you can imagine Cairo is more cosmopolitan in its nature, and where the majority of people live. But down south near Aswan, where the Ben Solar project went up, it's very conservative and to a degree even tribal. And so one of the issues we had around accommodation was the project was funded by EBRD, and you've got a mass, a serious mass, like 30,000 migrant labor being bussed in from the north of the country into the south of the country, and the various kinds of conflict situations which arose. And the one I'd like to highlight is, which leads on to a further discussion this afternoon, was around, we found some workers placed in a dormitory setup in a building in the center of Aswan on the second and third floors. But the first floor was a shelter for women that had been abused in the area. And clearly, it's not just the accommodation that you're looking at, but it's the context of where that accommodation is sitting in. You can't have 80 male workers sitting on the second and third floor of a building when on the first floor it's a home for women who have suffered abuse. So accommodation, not only the physical thing, but contextually in terms of cultural issues, gender issues is very important as to where these things are placed. That's just one example out of that project.
Thanks, Malcolm. Anybody else who would like to share any examples before we move on?
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is Ibrahim from Lagos, Nigeria.
Hi,
I just joined. Yes, I thank you. I just joined the session. I'm not sure if this point I want to make has been addressed previously, but I just thought that it aligns with the point that is being made on the slide before me. And that's the point that working conditions, especially camps, is particularly important more than ever before at the COVID era, because then the additional complexity of ensuring that the workers, the camp is operated safely is triggered. And a case in point is actually that of an IFC's client that happened just a few months ago at the early days of the COVID, where the workers at the camp, a major project in the oil and gas sector in Nigeria, the workers at the camp actually came out with social media posts on how they have been neglected and abandoned, therefore raising serious reputational issues for the project proponent. So yeah, that was the case that came to mind as I saw the slide. So the overall point is that it's really very important that the risks, the associated risks, are carefully looked into, and that should these days include those risks that have been triggered by the COVID situation. Thank you.
Thanks, Ibrahim. Yeah, I think COVID and workers' accommodation is a hugely difficult and contentious issue. I know IFC have published some guidance on how to manage COVID issues in the workplace, and I will also share that guidance in the chat after my presentation. Thanks, Ibrahim. This point here around freedom to unionize, I mean, in some countries, I haven't encountered it, but some countries prevent workers from unionizing in terms of national legislation. IFC Performance Standard 2 encourages management teams to come up with alternatives to unions and allow workers to enter into collective bargaining agreements and engage with management as a group rather than as individuals. So something to consider if it's an issue that you ever encounter. Non-discrimination and equal opportunity, obviously this is an issue for all the wrong reasons, has been in the press recently. Niraj is going to speak in the second half of today's session in a little bit more detail. I think the only point I want to make here is this is obviously something that is we are probably a little bit behind on in Africa compared to the rest of the world. In terms of the companies that I've engaged with, few of them have specific policies on sexual harassment and equal opportunities outside of South Africa. So certainly something that all of us are aware of and can provide some quite useful and valuable insight to management teams of companies that you do due diligences on. Final point on retrenchment, before I pause for further questions, is trying to get to the bottom of historical retrenchments can be very difficult. Understanding how a retrenchment process was conducted, it often requires quite a lot of deep investigation. It's always important to try and find out with any due diligence that you do if there's been a history of collective dismissals or large-scale retrenchments in recent times in the last few years. It's important because this can obviously impact on the business, but also impact on the reputation of a business. And it also speaks to how the management treat and view the workforce. The IFC Performance Standards 2 also promotes the development of a retrenchment plan, where a procedure and methodology is developed for selecting people who are eligible for retrenchment, for want of a better word, and for how compensation is paid out, emphasizing that the retrenchment process is done as transparently as possible and trying to get people to move on from a company voluntarily and helping company employees find new work after retrenchment has taken place. Again, hopefully it's not something that you encounter too often, but if you do, it is very important that you try and find what happened, especially if it happened a year or two ago. Often workers will be quite hesitant to speak to you about these types of issues. Malcolm.
Yeah, Ben, I think also from a, and I'm trying to place as much emphasis on the South African scenario, but at least in the projects-based area, where you're building renewable energy farms, etc., or you're building a port, an oil and gas port in Mozambique, or a pipeline from Uganda to Tanzania, you also have retrenchment within the project. And so again, learning from our Egyptian experience, where you've got a large number of let's say lower level contractors or labor on site who are doing the initial civil works, at some stage, the need for them on the project is going to disappear. So they'd essentially have a contract for X amount of time or until X milestone in the project is achieved. One of the dangers is where you're dealing with large numbers of labor is an expectation that the jobs are kind of there forever. It's such a big project that we will always be employed doing something. And so from a project perspective, retrenchment can also be seen as well at month 6 in the development of our mega project or our wind farm. We have less of a need for this type of labor, and typically one can visualize it saying your need for civils labor increases rapidly, it plateaus, and then it starts to decrease. And as that starts to decrease, you're probably going into a stage of commissioning of a project where your labor demand or the level of expertise that you require is perhaps higher. It's perhaps more of a technician kind of level, and you're going to get a transition from a labor base to a technical kind of base. And again, they're only there for a period of time during the commissioning phase, and then once the project is up and running, mostly these things are run by SCADA, and you've got 4 people sitting on site managing the entire project. The rest are sitting in Johannesburg or in Cape Town or even in Oslo or London or wherever you want to be, managing the project via SCADA. So what I find is important, and having learned on the Egyptian project and also on current projects in South Africa, is a retrenchment plan that deals with the various phases of labor demands for the development of projects, which is perhaps one of the biggest areas that we're involved in at least in the South African scenario.
Yeah, great point, Malcolm. I think it's something I've seen in renewable energy projects as well. This expectation of a job for 6 months is a job forever. Developing skills, helping people get themselves, advertising their skills and other opportunities at the end of that phase of the project is very valuable. Grievance mechanisms, right. A difficult topic. I would say 90% of companies that I've done due diligence on in South Africa and elsewhere don't have a grievance mechanism that meets the requirements of IFC Performance Standard 2. This can't just be a suggestion box. It needs to be a formal process. It needs to be a process where you can submit a grievance to HR, to senior management, to immediate management. You can submit a grievance anonymously, or you can submit a grievance without fear of retribution. The process needs to be documented and try and resolve the issue at different levels within the company. So within a department, within the unit, within the management team. Really important that the process is documented. And when you do a site visit, try and see examples of the grievance mechanism in action. So documented processes where there has been a resolution. I often find that a lovely grievance mechanism is on paper, but it's never actually used. Management will frequently tell you, oh yes, we have a great relationship with management, we don't use the grievance with the workers, we don't need to use the grievance mechanism at all. Everyone is happy, and I think you always need to dig a little bit deeper. Does anyone have any points on this slide? I'm conscious of time, but Malcolm or anyone else have any issues that they would like to raise? Cool. Okay, so protecting the workers and workers engaged by third parties. So child and forced labor, this is always a contentious issue outside of South Africa. I think it's very important to define what we mean by child labor. So child labor is defined, I think, by the ILO, and I'm sure people can correct me if I'm wrong, as labor that does not impact the health and safety of a child or their ability to attend school. So often when we do sessions like this in other countries in Africa, people will say, well, what about kids who are working on the farm? That is not child labor. Child labor is when a construction company is employing an 11-year-old to work a 9-hour day in the sun carrying bricks and doing harmful labor. So that's what we mean by child labor. By forced labor, we mean sort of like indentured labor or bonded labor. That's sort of the most frequent examples that you may come across. So I know that there are some examples in the Middle East where workers will be paid by the company to fly from their country of origin, and will have to pay off the flight costs before they start earning any money. That would be when we start thinking that it could be indentured or forced labor. So I think the best way to look out for issues around child and forced labor is to review contracts thoroughly, interview the workforce, and with child labor, all companies should have copies of identification documents for all workers where you can see the age. If companies don't have this, you need to recommend that they are requiring workers to provide them with their IDs prior to starting work. Workers engaged by third parties. Frequently in South Africa, this is labor brokers. You see it a lot in the farming sector. You need to ask if the contract workers are being provided by a legitimate broker. That you also need to understand responsibility for HR policies and procedures. So does the labor broker have their own grievance mechanism? Does the worker have access to the grievance mechanism of the company that they are working for, or the project that they are working on? Are they treated in a similar way to permanent staff of the company that the third-party workers are working for? Do they get the same number of breaks in the day? Do they finish at the same time? Are they provided with the same types of PPE and other types of health and safety equipment? So all types of considerations you need to look at, and then finally pay. Are staff provided by a labour broker paid in a similar way or in the same amount as workers who are employed by the company doing the same types of work? So all really important considerations. Supply chain. So this is an issue that I often get asked questions about. We're really talking about the primary supply chain. So that is the first level of a company supply chain. And we also need to consider materiality and amount of leverage. So if a company is a small company sourcing computers from Apple, and they read in the press that Apple have been sourcing some special metal from potentially child labor run by warlords in the DRC, should your company then go and do a full investigation of Apple to find out where the metal from their laptops is coming from? No, you have no leverage. You're not a material buyer from Apple, so therefore you have no influence over their practices. You may want to consider buying a Dell, but there's very little that you can do as a company. Whereas if you are a vanadium processing plant and you find that most of the vanadium that you are buying comes from a mine run by warlords using forced and child labor in the DRC, then you may want to try and find a different mine to source your supply from. So we're really talking about the first level within your supply chain. And a lot of companies will source products from China and other Southeast Asian countries where it's very difficult to assess these types of issues. Performance standards do not expect you to look at these types of issues as a small company in detail. It may be beneficial if your management team of a company goes to visit their factories on an annual basis to look out for things like child labor. You could even provide management with some form of checklist to say, look, if you guys are going to do your annual visit to the factories in Asia, it's worth, and you can say, look, it's worth looking out for the following types of issues. Okay, and then occupational health and safety. I think this could be a whole topic on its own. I also suspect I'm not a health and safety expert, and there are a lot of people on this call who have far more experience than I do of assessing health and safety issues. I think when you're doing DDs, you're only getting a snapshot of the company for a certain day in a certain phase of their production cycle, etc. What is important is to try and find some sort of documented evidence that health and safety procedures are in place, so that incidents are reported, that there are some sort of training register, that PPE is provided to workers and well maintained, that there is a risk register, that there is emergency drills, fire drills, correct signposting is in place in the event of emergencies. Things like that can sort of make you think, well, actually, this company's never done a fire drill, and the PPE it's providing to its workers is a little bit shoddy. So maybe this is an issue that requires further investigation. Similar with incident registers. If you find a company that's in the manufacturing sector and hasn't had an incident in 6 months, that's also a red flag, and it's very valuable to spend time speaking to workers to understand what is actually going on the ground. Does anyone have any other experiences or insights that they would like to share on this? Okay, I know that I've gone 10 minutes over time. I just want to raise 2 points. Alongside IFC Performance Standard 2 and all of the performance standard is a guidance note where they provide much more detailed guidance on how to implement the guidelines of Performance Standard 2. I've included an excerpt here. So the text in bold is from the Performance Standard 2 text, and then the subtext not in bold is the guidance document. Text. So it actually provides you with much more detail as to what should be included in a grievance mechanism, how the grievance mechanism should be developed, how it should interact with collective bargaining agreements, etc. So if you ever have a corrective action around a certain issue, whether it be in PS2 or another performance standard, I'll always recommend that you would take a look at the guidance note, because that will provide you with the detail of what a company needs to really do to make sure that they are following best practice. And then I think I just wanted to highlight on this slide that for a financial intermediary or financial institution, if you're ever assessing a financial institution by doing a DD, you need to consider the 2 types of PS2 risks it faces. So the staff of its own operations, and then the staff associated with the clients that it's lending to, or the underlying clients of the companies that they're investing in. So risks at an office-based sort of bank or private equity firm are quite low. I've listed a few of the examples of things to look out for, but obviously then when you're looking at clients and investee companies or portfolio companies, you need to look at the nature and size of the deals that the FI is doing. Are they taking controlling equity stakes as a private equity firm? Then PS2 labor issues at their investee companies are going to be much more significant than for a bank providing small loans to SMEs, where their leverage and the amount of money involved is very small. I know I've had to rush the last couple of minutes. Before I hand over to Malcolm and his presentation, does anyone have any questions or points that they would like to raise? Stony silence, that's always reassuring after you've been presenting for 45 minutes. Okay.
Job well done, Ben. Job well done.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Guys, I will obviously be sitting in now while Malcolm and Taboho present. So if you have questions, you can just message in the chat. I will share the accommodation guide and the COVID-19 response. Malcolm, I'm going to, yeah, great. You're going to share. I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you, everyone. And Malcolm, if you're feeling brave and you're not in your PJs, maybe people can see you while you present to help people interact.
Can you hear me there, Ben?
Yeah, 100%. I can hear you and we can see your screen. I don't know if you want to put it into presentation mode so it's a bit bigger.
Yeah, I'm just going to put it into presentation mode. I've just got to figure out which screen is presenting. Which screen are you seeing?
We are seeing we're actually seeing both. So we can see showing the one that you see as a presenter.
And now?
Yeah, now it's perfect.
Okay, well now I don't know how to show me video, I guess. Can you see me there?
Yes, we can.
All bald and attractive.
Yeah, you look great. Thanks for getting dressed up for us, Malcolm. And over to you.
No, it's a pleasure, Ben. It's always a pleasure. Let me just get rid of some fluff that's on the screen here. Okay, so Ben asked me to talk about a couple of practical examples around Performance Standard 2. And so I've really picked on two which I've come across in the last couple of months. I mean, there could be a whole host, and as been alluded to earlier, particularly from the health and safety perspective, one could talk about this for days on end, and its complications and innuendos. Sorry, I'm just trying to get the screen to change. And there we go. And there's various issues around the performance standards. Ben's gone through them, so I'm not going to talk about, rehash them. What I'm going to do is just talk about two issues. But to start with, when one looks at these performance standards, it's very easy to jump into the PSs themselves and start reading, item number 8.7 says that we should have a policy and we should have this, and we must have a grievance mechanism, etc. But a lot of, and I'm talking from a project basis, more so than a due diligence basis. However, you will see as I go through as the applicability of both. A lot of projects that are being funded around South Africa, mostly in the renewable energy sector at the moment, or funded projects, are coming out of DFIs or equated principles banks. And it's always important to go back to the founding requirement, which in this case is the equated principles bank. And remember that we are a non-designated country. In fact, the whole of Africa is non-designated, which from the equated principles, you'll recall, requires under equated principles 3 that the IFC performance standards are applied to the project as they may be applicable to the project. Obviously, in the first instance, compliance with legislation of the host country laws and regulations is a primary driver. But that for countries such as in South Africa or Africa, you have to look at the performance standards, and you need to use the World Bank EHS guidelines and other sector guidelines that may be applicable. Bearing in mind, of course, your equated principles bank can always, add extra things in. for example, I've got a client in the renewable energy sector who one of their major shareholders is a private equity company, which has equity coming out of Europe. And via the European equity, there are now requirements to comply with the European Union environmental impact assessment regulations dealing with the capacity and length of evacuation power lines from the renewable energy project. So you can get these extra things that come in, and one needs to always consider them as well. So leading from the equated principles, one goes through to the performance standards, and again requires obligation to comply with, at minimum, the host country regulations. It goes further in that it starts talking about, on item 6, good international industry practice. And there's a lot of good international industry practice around performance standard 2. A lot of my work, besides in the renewable energy sector, is obviously in the oil and gas sector. And in the oil and gas sector, there's those of you who have attended the prior sessions may recall that I've spoken about an organization called IPECA. And IPECA has a very good document dealing specifically with how to develop a grievance mechanism in the oil and gas sector. They have a very good document on how to develop a grievance mechanism in the community-based sectors. So using those good international practices, although they might not be specifically industry specific, they're still very good practices from which to draw on. So then again, in item 7, if you're not going to use the EHS guidelines, you need to provide really good information as to why you're not applying those guidelines. And that really led to, a good discussion around the second example I'll talk about shortly, relating to accommodation in the construction sector in South Africa. So the first example, really, that I've come across and bumped heads with a couple of times over the last few months, deals with the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and specifically around the construction regulations which are contained within the Health and Safety Act itself. For those of you who don't know, you've got the OSH Act, and we all liberally refer to the OSH Act, but very seldom do we go look at the various regulations which are published under the OSH Act. There's regulations that deal with lead, there's regulations that deal with asbestos, there's regulations that deal with underwater diving, and clearly there's regulations that are prescribed specifically for the construction industry. And so one of the requirements in that is that a baseline assessment, risk assessment, must be undertaken prior to construction. That baseline assessment in the South African scenario is typically covers your very rudimentary and elementary health and safety risks and hazards, which your civil engineer or your civil construction guys is going to identify and pick up. So in terms of that, the baseline risk assessment is an assessment prior to anything actually getting going on site. And the baseline risk assessment needs to be submitted to the Department of Labour for approval prior to activities taking on site. So it can be a tricky thing to do because you're kind of dealing with situations that aren't realized as yet. But it needs to take into account various things. It needs to account the basics of the industry sector itself. Are you working at height? Is there moving machinery? Is there going to be cold? Is there going to be transport? Are there going to be heavy vehicles? But it also talks to looking at the design of the installation that is going to be developed. And you know that if you go back into the performance standards around community health and safety, there's a section there that deals with design issues which need to be approved or assessed in order to minimize risk to community in terms of health and safety. What I've been finding a lot, and in as much as this week, is that the baseline risk assessments, which are being signed off by the Department of Labour and being done typically by a health and safety agent, are completely insufficient to satisfy the baseline requirements that one would expect in an IFC performance standard level assessment or risk assessment. It's too elementary, focusing on, the ergonomics and the injury basis of the construction process as well, but not looking broadly enough to address the broader expectations of the IFC performance standards. Granted that under the baseline risk assessment, you won't necessarily be looking at the environmental issues, the pure environmental issues, but you will be looking at environmental health. You will not necessarily be looking in detail around social risks, but you may be looking at issues around design, vehicle movement of heavy equipment and supplies through communities. So there is a crossover. And a couple of times now, and I say as of recently of yesterday, come across a baseline risk assessment, which has been approved by the Department of Labour, but really exclusively on a health and safety aspect around the workers' exposure to risks on a project basis. So one needs to elucidate and separate the risks and hazards, environmental, health, safety, social, which the IFC performance standards expect to see, as opposed to what is being delivered under the baseline risk assessments by the Department of Labour for the construction process, and then obviously also the task-based risk assessments, which are done once you know more detail about the tasks and you develop a risk assessment method statement, or more commonly known as a RAMS, that deals specifically with the movement of an item, let's say lifting a nacelle onto the top of a wind tower. So baseline risk assessments and the resultant specifications are obligated to be prepared by the client. So this would be your IPP company. It's not prepared by the EPC. Typically, the client organization does not have the necessary skills to do it. So they appoint a health and safety agent, which is now an authorized position under legislation now as well. Not anybody can be a health and safety agent. And this particular baseline risk assessment is then approved by the Department of Labour. That baseline risk assessment is then provided to the EPC on the project as a work to standard. And this is where the conundrum comes in, is that your EPC then receives this as a risk assessment, but doesn't get the full picture in terms of the project level risk assessment in terms of the IFC performance standards expectations, i.e. they're looking exclusively at construction health and safety issues and do not venture sufficiently deep into the environmental and the social side of an environmental social risk management system. The EPC would then provide, in terms of a process, would typically then provide the baseline risk assessment to the designer or the architect, and that's where you get your link to PS4, Community Health and Safety, that deals with infrastructure, equipment design and safety. And it's the obligation of the architect or the designer who's responsible for the design of the facility or the installation, and they need to approve that design. They need to make sure that that design is stable, that it's going to stay up, that the calculations, all the engineering calculations of weights and distributions and torque strains and whatever you need within that particular design or that facility are actually sufficient for what the purpose is going to be used for. and then they provide the written confirmation of approval to the client, who then hands that back to the EPC. So baseline risk assessments are not just an Excel spreadsheet that sits in the health and safety officer's computer or file, and then when you ask for it, they slap it out there. There's a lot more around the baseline risk assessment itself. Perhaps it's being done too shallow. Perhaps it needs to be done a bit more broadly thinking when you're dealing with a lender-funded or DFI-funded project. I'm not saying that the baseline risk assessment must be all-inclusive. The overall risk assessment for the project can come in various guises. It can be, you can have a project-level risk assessment for environmental and social. You could have the baseline risk assessment, you have task-based risk assessment, and ongoing risk assessment as well, as things and the profile of the project changes. So there's various mechanisms around that, and it's been a bit of a problem trying to educate the South African construction sector that what they have been doing is perhaps insufficient in the first place, but is definitely not fulfilling the requirements and expectations of IFC PS1 and PS2. So I'll break down if anyone's got any comments or queries around that. Nobody. Everybody can still hear me. Ben, you can still hear me.
Yeah, I'm here, Malcolm. It's not my area of expertise, so unfortunately I don't have anything to add, but it is very informative. Thank you.
No problem. So your IXP, from a systems perspective, your risk assessment of a project needs to be more comprehensive than just the civil construction regulation requirements. You are going to be looking at your environmental issues. And again, at this point, I'd say your environmental impact assessment is not a risk assessment. The risk assessment, it provides information to the impact, the environmental impact assessment provides information to the risk assessment, but it's not in and itself, it's not an entire risk assessment. So you've got to look at, are the right things being covered? What is the area of influence of the project? And sometimes your EIAs are getting that wrong as well. Your baseline risk assessment's area of influence is perhaps too minimal. It's looking at site-specific issues, whereas your IFC, whereas your EIA should be looking at a wider area of influence, relating to off-site issues, communities, off-site production in another town, labor issues, accommodation issues. So there's a lot more around risk assessment and understanding how the risk profile of a project changes through the processes of project initiation and laydown, construction phases, various processes in construction, commissioning, and then into the operational phase. And that risk profile changes significantly. Moving on to workers' accommodation, there's the reference that Ben was talking about earlier, workers' accommodation processes and standards, a guidance note by the IFC and EBRD. It's critical, and I think, as Ben alluded to earlier, we always think of, workers' accommodation and migrant labor as international movement of people, where it's quite often movement of people within a country. So, for example, I mentioned we've been working on the Benban Solar Park in Egypt, where there's a significant movement of migrant labor into the project area for a period of about 2.5 years, which is an extended period, from northern Egypt down to southern Egypt near Aswan, and the complications and the issues I mentioned earlier. However, in South Africa, you have a very similar kind of thing happening, but be it on a smaller scale, and obviously, as was mentioned earlier as well, compounded by the fact of the risks presented now by COVID-19. So, under the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, there's a sectoral determination for the civil engineering sector in South Africa. And within that lengthy document, there's a section 7 that deals with deductions and other acts concerning remuneration, whereby there's provision for deductions or amounts to be made with regarding to the rent of dwellings or accommodation in hostels where employees are put up in. Now, immediately you think, well, geez, this is just completely the opposite to what Ben was telling us, is that we shouldn't be charging people for accommodation, we shouldn't be charging them for flights and travel, and then getting them to work it off. So an employer shall not make deductions from an employer's remuneration other than with the written consent of the employee. Deduct an amount that has to be paid to, and in this item, to any organization or body in respect of the rent of a dwelling or accommodation in a hostel occupied by such people. So if you think a lot of the renewable energy projects that are happening around South Africa, be they solar, be they CSP, be they wind, be they hydro, a lot of these projects are taking place in relatively isolated areas where the skills level of the people and the number of employable people is pretty low. So a lot of these projects are actually importing people from larger centers such as Cape Town, Durban, Port Elizabeth, Johannesburg, into the particular project area. So you've got a wind farm going up in the Karoo somewhere. You need 2,000 civil laborers on site. The small towns around the area don't have the capacity to supply the numbers or the technically skilled people to do that. So a lot of these people are coming in from other areas. If you look under the construction regulations, under construction welfare facilities, a contractor shall provide reasonable and suitable accommodation for the workers at a construction sites which are remote from their homes. So you've got two kinds of things saying it. Firstly, you've got the OSH Act saying under the construction regs, you need to provide for these people. And under the sectoral guidelines for civil engineering, it says you can deduct and you can take a fee from these for accommodation once you've obtained written consent from the employee. What is typically happening is that the contracting company is providing an additional stipend to the employee and saying, here is an extra fee of 3 to 5, maybe 600 Rand a month. Go and find yourself accommodation in the near town village. And they tend to wash their hands of the issue, which says, we're covering ourselves in terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and we're not deducting any fee from the employee. We're in fact giving them an accommodation stipend, and now they're responsible to go and find their own accommodation. The problem is that doesn't kind of all add up, because what's happening in the real world is that in these small towns, because there's an influx of people, the accommodation rates and fees are being exacerbated. Instead of getting a rent for 500 Rand now rent's gone up to 1,000 Rand. What's also happening is a lot of these workers are renting out backroom accommodation in the township type areas in these small towns and villages. Ben alluded to and mentioned the list of requirements for accommodation under the IFC EBRD workers' accommodation standards. And I've worked quite extensively with them, especially having been exposed to them in Egypt. where you start talking about the floor space in the room, the number of no more than 4 persons in the room, the meterage and the spacage between beds, no double beds, provision of washing facilities, laundry facilities, Wi-Fi facilities. You start talking about flooding, water, sanitation, health and safety. The requirements become quite onerous. So by providing the workforce on a South African project a stipend and saying, go to the town and find your own accommodation, is not really the best way out of it, because most of these guys are ending up renting back rooms in very substandard conditions, which do not in any way align themselves with the IFC EBRD worker accommodation requirements themselves. Performance Standard 2 talks about the quality and management of the accommodation. And when it starts talking about basic services, they're listed there. I'm not going to read them all. It talks about camp, cold, damp, fire, disease, carrying animals, sanitation, washing facilities, etc. And in some cases, basic medical services. These are not services that you're going to be able to provide in accommodation for a stipend of 500, 1,000 or 2,000 Rand a month. So accommodation becomes quite a difficult situation around development projects, renewable energy projects in South Africa at the moment. A lot of these projects have been worked up on a financial close with various funders, and the budgets are pretty tight. And now you come onto a project and you say, hang on, your accommodation is not good enough. 80% of your migrant workers are renting backroom accommodation in shacks. This is not in line with the expectations of the funders in terms of the IFC performance standards. Quite honestly, what happens most of the time is everyone tries to turn a blind eye to it, change the subject, and let's forget about it until we discuss it next week. And it's become a problem to the degree that it exacerbates itself, because you have your workers ending up in township kind of shacks. Workers also renting RDP houses, causing local people to be displaced. The increase in the cost of renting in these small towns comes to the detriment of local people, and local people now have their places of accommodation put at risk because they can't afford the exacerbated rent. Backroom shacks don't fulfill the expectations. And then, of course, you've got migrant workforce being forced to live within the local population, which brings in the social impacts and the diseases. So it's a real practical difficulty in trying to figure out how does one deal with it. Anyway, so Ben and I and a couple of guys got together last week, and we said, how does one deal? What are the options? Well, the first option is to provide an accommodation stipend, which allows for renting, that fulfills the expected IFC EBR standard. But you can imagine how much that's going to cost per worker. If you've got, say, 500 or 600 workers, and you need to start now putting up maybe 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 Rand per worker per month, that can significantly impact on the cost of a project, which perhaps wasn't accounted for in the beginning. The other option is to enter into a facility, a hotel or a hostel, where workers can be accommodated where it fulfills the requirements of the standard. So in a lot of these smaller towns around the Karoo and in the Drakensberg area and up Northern Cape area, those facilities just simply don't exist. The other option is, of course, to go ahead and build a workers' construction camp, which in itself is exceedingly expensive to build it to the right standards and the right costs with all the necessary facilities. And then maybe it's only going to be there for 9 months to 18 months. And then what do you do with it afterwards? So it's not that one has an answer for the situation. It's to how does one actually resolve these issues? And the only advice I can give on it is early, upfront, understanding the scope of the project. It's not only talking about developing wind turbines. It's understanding in the EIA phase that you're going to have migrant workers coming into the area, that the human resource in the local area is insufficient. That with migrant labor, there are these other issues around accommodation that need to be resolved. Other issues around social issues, gender-based violence, which increases because there's an increase of money in the area now, increase of COVID transmissions in the areas, bringing in guys from the cities into these smaller towns and exposing a lot of the population in these towns, which are usually old and young people. Your working class people typically have left the areas. And so the social evils, just essentially exacerbate themselves. And so clear understanding right up front in the EIA phase, which makes the EIA more expensive, obviously, but to elucidate and figure out what the community health, safety, social accommodation, worker standards are all going to be about. That's me. Any questions?
Thanks, Malcolm. I found that really interesting in the role of the accommodation and how you incorporate it into the ESIA. I think it's a very important social consideration given the potential impacts if it goes wrong. Any questions? Has everyone fallen asleep?
Am I just talking to you, Ben?
It's a very
Tebogo normally has something to say.
Yeah, I actually had a million questions to ask you, but I'm just worried about time.
Well, Tebogo, do you want to ask one question and then we can hand over to you?
Maybe I'll be able to answer that question myself.
Oh, no. Okay, Tebogo, can you take control of the PowerPoint and share your screen? I think you should be able to. So I think in the interest of time, to everyone's great relief, let's try do the quiz at the end. I can share the link and people can do the quiz offline. And then we can still, if Tebogo can present in sort of 20 minutes or so, and then we can have a 10-minute break for the second half of the session. Tebogo, I've made you the presenter. Can you share your screen now? Tebogo, you're on mute.
Or is my, oh, sorry.
Yes, okay, now you just need to share your screen. We can hear you.
Can you see my screen now?
No, so at the bottom, there should be an icon that says share content.
Yes, that's what I have done. And then,
otherwise, if you can't, I can share your oh, yeah, no, it's coming. And please, guys, don't be shy. Please ask questions. Otherwise, Paul Tebogo feels like he's speaking to just me and Malcolm. Okay, Tebogo, we can hear you and we can see your screen now, so I'm going to hand over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. You can also hear my voice, I guess.
PS2, labor and waiting for.
Go ahead, Tebogo. I'm just muting people who are naughty.
Can you hear my voice now?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm too ugly. I don't think you want to see my face, huh? Okay, good morning once again, colleagues. Ben and Malcolm have already captured most of the areas that I wanted to share. So I'll focus on a few, maybe 2 or 3 very unusual cases, and then move on to the audit perspectives of this PS2. I've titled my presentation Auditor's Dilemma. You may be wondering why Auditor's Dilemma. Because many companies we audit have all the necessary documentation and tick all the boxes. But the reality on the ground tells a different story. The reality does not always reflect the vision, the mission, the rosy strategy documents that you find on the walls of the head office in Sandton, as Malcolm was saying earlier today. There seems to always be a huge gap between the HR policies and processes at head office and the HR practices on site or on the ground. Now, an audit is almost always a snapshot at a particular day. And the auditors have neither the time, the resources, nor the tools to test the effectiveness of these policies, the strategies, the programs, and so on. That is to test the extent to which they yield the desired results, which is essentially an effective risk management. And very often the auditor's terms of references are limited to assessing compliance against lenders' requirements, but not testing the effectiveness of the company's risk management efforts. And I agree with Malcolm that we tend to think of EIAs as being risk management tools, but they're not. They provide information to the risk management efforts. The question that we should be asking ourselves as auditors is, are auditors reporting in a manner that gives the lenders an accurate picture of the labor-related risks that the company is facing, the significance or materiality of these risks, and the company's ability or capacity to manage these risks? If not, then most of our audits are just fruitless academic exercises. Ben, is anybody still there?
Yes, I'm still here.
Yep.
Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear.
I get worried when I hear total silence. Okay, I have spent most of my life, most of my professional life as an auditor, but I've also been fortunate enough to work as a SHE project manager in Qatar, a resident environmental monitor during the construction of Kasidem, which you can see on your screens now, those beautiful pictures. When you see pictures like these, you think this was a very successful project. But if I tell you stories about this project, you'll see how difficult it is to implement some of these principles and concepts and requirements. And I've also had a chance to not only work on this project as a consultant with the design and supervision engineers, but I also chaired the board for some time. So I've also looked at labor issues from the governance point of view. But my focus today, will, as I said, will be on auditing, and I hope Bongani and Francois and Cheyenne, you'll be able to chip in from time to time. In the interest of time, I'm not going to spend too much time on things that Malcolm and Ben have already covered. I will move straight to a few cases. But just to illustrate the points I made about the situation on the ground being different from the audit findings. If you look at the labor situation in South Africa, we have a huge unemployment rate of about 30.1%. What does this mean for the labor market? Can anybody with some experience in labor issues tell us what this means for the labor market?
Does it mean there's an oversupply?
Exactly. And what does that do?
Demand and supply means they'll end up dictating the price and conditions in favor of whosoever is employing.
Exactly. It gives a lot of power to the employers and takes it away from the employees, because employees are desperate to get jobs. Jobs are hard to find. There's tension, there's volatility, there's anxiety. And this often results or rather manifests itself in many different ways, including tribal tensions, racial tensions, rivalries, including inter-union rivalries at the workplace. Now, if you look at the number of CCMA referrals in South Africa, this number of 193,000 comes from the 2019 financial year. Even though the assessment of the content of the cases comes from the 2008 paper. But the 193,000 referrals that were made to the CCMA, what does that tell us about the company's internal grievance mechanisms?
They're not working.
They're non-existent, aren't they? Because if companies had internal grievance mechanisms, internal dispute resolution forums, we wouldn't have this many CCMA referrals, would we? And if we look at the major causes of strikes, as assessed by those who did some research into these CCMA causes, they say it's a mismatch between wage offers and wage demand. And now the question is, what is behind these demands? Why are workers forever demanding higher wages?
I feel like that could be a PhD thesis, Boho.
Okay, now let's look at this one. In 2018, more than 1 million working days were lost. And workers lost 266 million rents in wages in 2018. At what point do we move from the joy of getting a job to the anger of wanting to ban and destroy everything? Anybody wants to comment on that? If people are so desperate to get jobs because there are no jobs, there's such a high unemployment, at what point do we move from the joy of having a job to having so much anger that we want to kill, we want to ban stuff?
Sure. Just one very small comment, Alexandra here. Just that I would go back to the grievance mechanism that most workers feel frustrated, unheard, and the reality at home is very different at the reality at work. When that reality has a big gap, the differences start feeling very real.
Yeah. But I can guarantee you that every company will claim to have grievance mechanisms and dispute resolution forums, and everything is there on paper. Okay, let's just go very quickly through some of the audit observations that we've picked up in the last couple of years. In fact, just yesterday, I was reviewing one of Francois' reports, one of Francois' audit reports, and it was an almost perfect report, almost a perfect system. All the documentation is there, 9 different types of audits, 5 communication types, all the forums are there. But if I tell you what company that is, you'll be surprised, because it has had some serious labor issues, but we're not going to talk about that. So companies always have adequate PS2 aligned policies, recruitment policies, remuneration policies. They have transparent, clearly articulated HR processes and procedures. They have recognition agreements with unions. Every employee has access to disciplinary processes, and legal recourse is guaranteed by the company. The wage grading system is clearly outlined. And very often, this is the only negative that I have picked up, is many companies do not have retrenchment policies. And retrenchments are treated as black swan risks, even though they know that those always happen. It's only construction companies that know that they have a limited lifespan that will always have retrenchment policies. But even the construction companies, the challenge has always been that the retrenchment policies are not designed through consultation with the unions, because at the start of construction, there are no unions. The unions come in later, and very often the unions will claim that they were not party to the design of the retrenchment policies or retrenchment plans. But there's not much that any construction company can do about it, because like I said, at the start of construction, there are no unions. The unions come in later. And very often there's conflict between performance management systems and wage equity requirements. What in your opinion constitutes wage equity?
Sorry to behold, what's wage equity?
People getting equitable wages for work of equal value, for equitable value.
Between people doing the same job or between different positions in the company?
Different positions in the company, because equity is not the same as equality. We don't have any HR experts in here. No? Okay, here's my take on this. First of all, as I said earlier, and as somebody supported me earlier, I can't remember who that is, there is inadequate internal labor dispute resolution forums within companies and ineffective grievance mechanisms. And this is evidenced by those CCMA referrals. And there's inadequate engagement between employers and employees, which results in very adversarial relationships. And that, like I said, this is probably what explains the transition from joy to extreme anger. Because very often, I don't know if you guys have seen a report that came out recently that shows that only 10% of managers actually have managerial skills. And this is one of the reasons that there are so many tensions within the workplace. And lack of community engagement, environmental and social impact assessments are not sufficient to understanding the social dynamics that can have undesirable impacts on workers. And lack of tools for continuously scanning the operating environment, social and socio-political risks. In fact, let's just quickly run two examples that I wanted to discuss with you today. And one of them would be shocking to many people who have not worked in the Arab world. And both Ben and Malcolm emphasized earlier on about PS2 promoting compliance with national laws. But the question is, what happens when there are national laws that are not consistent with the PS2 principles? And I've come up with one very, very, very concerning example of a Qatar labor law. The Qatar Labor Law 14 of 2004, which is where I was working in 2004 and 2004, the labor code strictly prohibited foreigners from joining unions and embarking on industrial action. This was seen by the government as undermining the authority of the state. Isn't that clear discrimination?
Definitely is.
And now what was even more concerning is that there's something called the sponsorship law. I tried to look for a copy of the earlier version of the sponsorship law. I couldn't find it. I found the 2018 version, which is a much improved sponsorship law, but it still doesn't have any cover for foreign workers. For those who don't know what sponsorship law is, in the Arab world, in most of the GCC countries, if you're a foreign worker, you come into the country through sponsorship by somebody. Very often you come through the broker, but the broker hands you over to an employer. That employer becomes your sponsor. You're there because of your sponsor. You cannot institute any legal proceedings against your sponsor, because if your sponsor withdraws the sponsorship, you are required to leave the country within 48 hours.
Wow.
Now the question is, as a foreign worker, do you have any rights whatsoever? Because the moment you raise a grievance against your sponsor, all that the sponsor can do is just withdraw the sponsorships and you have to get onto the plane and leave.
Yeah, connected. Because I couldn't access my computer.
Okay. So now we can.
Yeah, now I can. We didn't have internet here.
I'm just not sure what's happening.
Sorry, somebody's talking in the background there. Can you please mute your mic? Okay, so here's the situation, colleagues. I don't know if anybody can tell us how to deal with it from an audit point of view. We have a national law that is not consistent with PS2. Ben, I don't know if you can see who's not muted his mic.
It's very annoying. I'm sorry. I am desperately trying, but please mute your microphone, whoever it is. Thank you.
Okay, and this colleagues is a real example. It's not a hypothetical situation. It's something that I witnessed with my own eyes. I was one of those who were on those so-called sponsorship contracts in Qatar. And I learned this at the time that I wanted to institute legal proceedings against my employers because they had failed to pay me for 3 weeks. Comments on that?
Hello? Hello?
Silence. I thought you would all be shocked by this.
I am shocked. Yeah, we can hear you, Ibrahim.
Yeah, so very interesting perspectives. But please correct me if I'm wrong. The performance standards did say that where a national law contradicts the provisions of the standard, then the provision of the standard would apply. If that, however, it's another thing. But I would think that, from an audit perspective, you would want to see the superiority of the requirements of the performance standards in these situations. However, again, the practicality will be very interesting. My thoughts. Thank you.
Tiboho, Malcolm here. I've just been thinking about it. It is quite a unique situation, and we often sit here and we kind of deal with Roman law, which in our minds makes logical sense, but often, and you use the example of the Arab world, the basis of law is different. And it has often, interpretation from those who hold religious sway and power in the country. What would be interesting is to figure out whether the engagement that you were under was an engagement under the IFC performance standards, and whether, and if that was the case, whether when one goes to a court of law, someone's really killing the cat there. That's better. In any case, if you put yourself in the South African sense and you were based on a project, it's how, and you're an imported laborer into South Africa, and you were on a DFI funded project, and you had a grievance. That grievance is managed in the court of law under the laws of the country, not under the laws of the IFC performance standards. So I'm guessing it's going to be similar in Qatar or the Arab world, where the project itself may be regulated under the performance standards as such, but once you enter the court of law, it's perhaps seen that you forego that and you're now operating exclusively under the domain of the sponsorship law, which I know when we worked in Egypt, we were also under sponsorship by the company that would engaged us. And it is difficult. And yeah, it's perhaps easier for us that are acting on a professional basis to understand and perhaps try and realize this. But when it comes down to your imported labor coming from Asia to work in Qatar to build a football stadium, and they're not being paid, it opens up that as well. Is there recourse in a court of law that acknowledges the performance standards? I don't think there is.
Any last questions, guys? I think we have about 2 minutes before we take a 5-minute break. Anything else, Teboho?
Okay, let me pass that point then and come to the next one, which is around wage disparity. There are 2 examples I wanted to give. Number one is about that project I told you about, Katsidem, where the contractor was using 2 very different wage grading systems, which created a lot of tensions amongst the employees. The first wage grading system was the normal one that every company does, which grades people according to qualifications and experience. But then there was another very unique one that the contractor was using for all the plant, particularly the moving plant, trucks, dozers, backhoe actors, and everybody. Operators were not paid according to any grade. They were paid a percentage of the rental value of that machine. And that had a very interesting dynamic in the sense that even though the operators of bulldozers and backhoe actors and cranes and trucks and everything were regarded as junior laborers, their salaries tended to be higher than those of the senior laborers, including their own supervisors. Because like I said, they were paid a percentage of the rental value of the machines they were operating. And that rental value turned out to be higher at the end of each month than the money that was paid to their more senior supervisors and the guys in the workshops doing repair and maintenance. And one of the strikes that we had there was actually the maintenance guy at the workshop wanting higher salaries because they had learned that the operators were getting almost twice what they were getting. So you have this wage disparity that is created by different wage grading systems rather than an intent on the side of the employer to pay people differently. And when it comes to the Medupi power station issue, I don't know how many of you have worked on that project or how many of you have read about all the various issues on the project, including multiple strikes and banning of vehicles and everything. And very often it had to do with different pay scales by different packages. You know, the power station is so big. Remember, it's a 200 billion rand contract that it was constructed in multiple packages. That means you could have the same type of labor working on different packages. We had, I think, as many as 39 packages at one time within the same site. So you have somebody who's an unskilled labor working for one package and earning a certain amount of money, and another employee working for a separate package earning much higher than that because they were brought in by different brokers, they're employed by different employers, and those employers do not use the same pay scales. And a good example of how this can be dealt with is what Shayani would remember, Kabameti project wanted to do before they moved into the area was to do a benchmarking exercise to find out what everybody was paying their laborers, rather than move in at your own rate, because that creates tensions between laborers who live in the same camp but work for different packages. Now, the last point is about expatriates and locals. I think, Malcolm, you mentioned something about the
Boho, please, can you be really quick, because we are completely out of time. I'm so sorry.
Okay. Okay, let's just look at two other issues that Malcolm mentioned earlier on. One is the housing accommodation issue, and one is a very interesting example I wanted to share with you about the ablution saga. You know, you said about the accommodation that there's a certain quality that is required, and only those workers who come from remote areas that are far from the work, the project site, need to be accommodated. The problem with this, particularly with remote projects, is you create a situation where expatriates have better facilities than locals. Locals live in small traditional huts. Expatriates live in very beautiful electrified campsites with water and everything. And that tension between locals and expatriates can lead to some serious consequences for the employer. The ablution saga I wanted to discuss with you is where PS2 sometimes fails to recognize the local culture. It may sound like a funny thing, but it is true. It's a very true story. On construction site and also in the living hostels, they provided the toilets that you know, the flush toilets. But unfortunately, the locals who come from the rural areas did not know how to use the flush toilets. And in fact, were very reluctant to use them because of their own beliefs and the water snakes and so on coming through the toilet and biting their bowls. So they tended to squat on the toilets rather than sit on them. And what the contractor did to try and mitigate that was to remove the flush toilets and replace them with the long drops. Does anybody know what a long drop is?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, looks like I'm talking to people who have never been on a construction site.
No, we know it.
But what happened was when the World Bank people came to assess the site, they raised that as an issue, that those are not acceptable forms of ablution for a project of that nature. Now the question is, if PS2 is not consistent with the local culture, what do we do as auditors? Okay, but I don't think there will be any need for me to discuss further on this questionable modern slavery practices, because that would be a very long discussion. But I will share my slides. You put your minds to them, and maybe we can discuss at a later date how to deal with those, including the so-called wage bondage and retention bonuses and secondary supply chain workers. Particularly in the South African context, where companies want to be seen to be reaching out to the local communities by buying stuff from them, but some of those rural communities use child labor. And child labor is common and accepted norm in those communities. If you go to many of the rural areas, you'll find very young children working on the commercial farms. And there's nothing wrong with that. But then the thing is, as an employer, can you purchase products from such local communities or cooperatives?
Taboho, I'm afraid we have to stop there. I'm sorry to be rude, and you have some very valuable examples, but I know Niraj is waiting very patiently to present. And do you, I know that you'll share the presentation, and I think everyone has Taboho's contact details, and they're probably also in the slide deck. Guys, I'm very conscious of time and wanting to finish on time. Do people want a break, or can we push on? What's the feeling in the group? I'm inclined to push on unless people feel that we need to pause for 5 minutes?
Push
Please
on.
speak up. Push on. Thanks, Malcolm. Adika?
Push on, Ben.
Okay. Well, this is a democracy, so 2 is a majority. That's great. Okay, so Niraj, are you there?
Hi there. Yes, I'm here. Can you let me know if you can hear me well?
I can hear you very clearly. Thanks, Niraj.
Okay, because I don't have one of those
headsets.
It's through my laptop that I'm communicating with. Hi everyone. My name is Niraj Shah. I am one of IFC social specialists based out of Nairobi in Kenya. And over the past year and a half, expanding some of the scope of what we look at under PS2 to include an aspect of risk that we haven't traditionally looked at in much depth previously, but is becoming much more of a significant issue. It's not a new issue. It's just that we're looking at it a little bit more in depth and including that as part of our risk assessment and working with companies to try and manage the risks. It is a significant issue in a lot of our investment. It's a hidden issue, and it's something that we are now systematically looking at all of our investments going forward, and also looking at our past existing investments to understand if there is any latent risk or risks that we haven't previously assessed that we should be aware of, and to try and work with the companies to address. So this is basically addressing gender-based violence and harassment. It's a new topic. It's a difficult topic. It's a topic that I'm also learning as we go along. But this presentation is focused around an emerging good practice for the private sector in the form of a guidance note that we have recently published together with the CDC and EBRD. So I'm just going to share my. Ben, can you see?
Yeah, we can see. It's just not in presentation mode yet.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So yes. So this is a new publication that IFC, together with CDC and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, has disclosed. It's available on our website, and I believe the presentation will have links at the end. It is a 15-slide presentation. I know that I only have a certain amount of time, so I'll quickly whiz through it. The idea is just to give an overview of what this guidance note is about, and not to go too much into detail about it. But if there are any questions, I will try and leave some time towards the end. And obviously, I'm available after that, after this this session as well. So the guidance note is structured around 2 parts. The first part focuses on explaining what gender-based violence and harassment is, and also outlines the business case for addressing it. The second part is it goes into providing some practical guidance based on emerging good practice in relation to assessing, preventing, responding to, and monitoring GBVH. And so the second part is what, in essence, the practical part, what companies should be coming to time and time again for practical and regular use as part of your risk management in the companies that you're working with. So the slides will cover both part A and part B. There are a set of 3 guiding or sectoral briefs based around different sectors, 3 different sectors: manufacturing, public transport, and construction, which is where we see the most significant risk in relation to GBVH that presents itself. And the idea is to provide helpful information about risks and also present examples of prevention measures for each sector. So what is gender-based violence and harassment? So the definition that the IFC uses comes from the ILO Convention concerning the elimination of violence and harassment in the world of work. It is violence and harassment, which is directed at people because of their sex or gender, and or family or individual levels to be inferior to man or masculinity. And GBVH is often used by persons to perpetuate this gender inequality, and to maintain power of the status quo. Manifests itself in very different ways. And it's experienced by women. 1 in 3 women, based on surveys undertaken worldwide, 1 in 3 women experience some form of physical or sexual violence during their lifetime. Some examples here, based on surveys, 64% of LGBTQI plus people in Southeastern Europe feel that they're bad to hide their sexual orientation or gender identity at work in order to protect themselves. 82% of people in Mongolia have seen or experienced sexual harassment in their workplace. And in India, for example, the Fair Wear Foundation, which is a foundation that represents or that looks after the conditions of people working in the apparel industry, reports that at least 60% of garment and factory workers have experienced sexual harassment at work. So it is very prevalent in all circumstances. Gender-based violence and harassment takes many different forms. It could be sexual, psychological, economic, and physical. Sexual forms could include sexual exploitation, sexual abuse, and sexual harassment. Physical forms can include both the threat of and actual use of force. Psychological forms can include verbal abuse, non-verbal abuse, and bullying. And economic forms can include restriction in access to financial resources or other resources such as food or medicine. So where does gender-based violence and harassment occur? It could occur amongst workers in a company and its supply chain, between workers and community members, between workers and service users, amongst users of company services or infrastructure, local authorities against workers, community members or service users, and within workers' families and intimate relationships. It's not just prevalent in all sort of workplace environments, but it manifests itself in different forms, including within families as well. And I think this has become quite evident in this lockdown during the pandemic. We've seen a huge increase in domestic violence cases in many countries. So the guidance note provides concrete examples of what each others might look like across the 4 different forms of GBVH outlined in the previous slide. And it's particularly important that companies and investors are alert to GBVH risks in situations that they may have a degree of influence over, and especially in situations where their operations may contribute or exacerbate such risks. So what is the business case for addressing GBVH impact on individual well-being? So physical health. GBVH may lead to injuries, pain, bruising, scarring, which may lead to productivity falls. It may lead to mental health, depression, anxiety, trauma, suicide at its worst form, but also at its more sort of less acute or extreme forms, may lead to absences at work because of mental health and physical health issues, and then sexual and reproductive health, especially in relation to STDs and unwanted pregnancies. But at the same time, underpinning all of this, there is a strong, besides a business case, which obviously companies want to try and understand so that they can put more resources and try to address something. At the end of the day, there is a strong moral and ethical reason for addressing GBVH in the private sector, which I think trumps all of the above in terms of business case. And then, of course, financial well-being, reduced income, lack of control of income resources. And this could lead to a number of implications, or may have a number of implications for companies. As I mentioned, productivity, health and safety, access to skills and talent, and worker retention. And then there could also be cases where employers or workers facing sexual harassment and gender-based violence may litigate or put in compensation claims against the company, and there will be reputational issues as well. Okay. So moving on to Part B, this is just an overview of what Part B looks at. There are a set of overarching principles and the process that is followed, which is to assess the risk, to put in prevention measures, and then to monitor. And within all of this, framing all of this is the response in each of these different steps. What is the response from the company in the event of a case occurring? And we'll briefly go through all of these now. So the overarching principles should be survivor-centered and safe. So what does this mean? It should prioritize the needs of people who have experienced and witnessed GBVH, and it should be safe enough for them to come out and report and on their experiences and gender-based violence and harassment cases. It should be context-specific and integrated, so take into account local, legal, and social context, and it should be embedded in efforts in existing processes and management systems, including how certain countries might already have systems and processes that can manage specific cases as they come through. Should be inclusive and non-discriminatory, and collaborative and well-informed. So each of these overarching principles are explained in further detail in the guidance note, and I won't go through any more on these right now in this presentation. So the first step is to assess gender-based violence and harassment risk, and to assess the capacity of the company to assess those risks. The first step of this is to screen risks, and this could be looking at country context, and the guidance note goes into delves deeper into the access to databases and information that are publicly available to understand the country context of gender-based violence and harassment risks. Many countries have a higher risk because of cultural, specific cultural context, and so on and so forth. And there is a lot of information out there in the web that companies or assessors may have access to understand country context risk. And then the specific investment activities which might exacerbate or might reveal further issues and risks, the collectively it together with the country context might give you a better understanding of what are the risks of a particular company that may face that a particular company may face from a GBVH perspective. It is important to also assess the company's capacity and resources to prevent and respond to GBVH. This may also reveal the need for external resources. It is a very sensitive topic, and an untrained eye may miss out on specific issues and risks. And so that knowledge of when to do things in-house and when to bring in an external expert is very important when you come to assessing the capacity. The second step is in relation to preventing GBVH and encouraging reporting. And there are a number of steps here which collectively, areas which collectively help to prevent GBVH from happening in the first place, and also encouraging safe reporting when it does. And the 7 sort of areas that relate to this cover leadership and company culture, policies and codes of conduct, grievance mechanism and investigation procedures, recruitment and performance assessments, training and awareness raising, working with contractors and suppliers, and physical design of the workspace as well. It is important that companies and investors understand that the actions in all of these areas do not need to be taken at one go collectively. This could be incremental, or not all of these could be relevant for a specific company, and a phased approach can be taken. The guidance note gives further details on each of these aspects, and Annex 6 to the guidance note provides a template for a company GBVH policy as well, and a summary of the types of information that it contains. The third step is responding to specific reports of GBVH in the event of a case coming to your attention or to the company's attention. What should a company do? What should an investor do? Oh, sorry. Okay, how do I go back? Okay, there we go. So the guidance outlines issues to consider in relation to response of reports to GBVH, and there is a section on company responses and a separate one on investor responses. It's also important to note that companies and investors may need to respond to reports of GBVH at any time, even at the point of initial assessments, when for example, at the stage of screening, if issues are identified. It should also be highlighted that there may be a serious risk of further harm of retaliation against people who report GBVH, which they may have experienced or witnessed. And so the responses need to be addressed very sensitively. And it's essential that those who manage such responses are thoroughly trained on how to do this in a safe manner. And Annex 7 to the guidance note provides detailed information on how to do this, including on how to set up grievance mechanism and invest in a high-risk situation based on the country context, on the specific sector, and or how to manage GBVH risk. Then moving on to monitoring GBVH risks and observation during site visits. And again, importantly, in high-risk context, getting a specialist to come in and work with the company and work with the the workers and also with the communities to understand risks and to monitor risks is quite important. The guidance note has a set of annexes which have practical tools and additional information. I think there are 9 annexes: indicators of GBV risk, a phased approach to prevention and response, questions to assess company capacity and resources, an approach for an in-depth assessment of risks, integrating GBVH risks into due diligence and impact assessments, templates for company policy on GBVH, mechanisms, investigation procedures, KPI examples, and a database of international and regional conventions and commitments on gender-based violence and harassment. So that is the new guidance note. We hope that you will have a chance to read it, to use it. And if there are any questions that you have, I'm happy to answer them if I can right now, or to come back to you individually. And feel free to reach out to me separately as well if need be. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Niraj. That was really insightful, and I found it very interesting. Any questions? I'm sure.
Yeah, this is Ibrahim. Yes.
Hi, Ibrahim.
Yeah, thanks, Niraj, for that beautiful presentation. But my concern, as an African, I can relate with a lot of the social constructs and the traditional beliefs that can pose GBV risks. So my question is, how are what is referred to as harmful social practices that can be precursors to GBVs and related risks? How are these social local practices? How are they addressed within the provisions of these guidelines? Thank you.
Thanks, Ibrahim. So, the guidelines do not set out to change harmful cultural or social practices. The guidelines are aimed at understanding whether it's in the workplace environment or a community environment, and to understand how a company or a company's activities might exacerbate that risk or might introduce a new risk or a new element of that risk. And so it's to try and manage it within the constraints of the company environment, and to try and manage it in relation to, for example, during construction of, there might be an influx of workers coming in. How do you manage the risks that might be posed as a result of the influx vis-a-vis the community, or risks which might be present inherent in the community? So it's to understand the contextual risk, to understand how those risks might be exacerbated by the presence of a project or of a workforce within, whether this is with the communities and internally as well within the workforce of the company. Just a very brief answer to that. It is a difficult topic area, and it is something that is it's going to be a challenge for companies to try and let alone get a grip over, but to understand. But it's something that we cannot ignore and we cannot brush or sweep under the carpet. So this guidance document that IFC, CDC, and EBRD have presented is aimed at helping companies to try and understand what GBVH is, to try and understand what can be done, and to put in place the systems and processes to try and manage that risk. But it is important to understand that where companies or company members or management, where they do not understand such risks, and where there is a very high contextual risk and a high risk of a project exacerbating it, to reach out to an external expert to come in and support them in developing their management of such risks.
Niraj, I have a question, if you may. Obviously, assessing these types of issues in a due diligence site visit scenario is very challenging. I mean, is there any advice in the guidance notes around that, and kind of what your thoughts are on that issue?
Yes, no, Ben, that's a good question. Yes, there is. In fact, the guidance note is focused around not just companies, but also investors as part of the due diligence. So, there are a number of layers of risk management or risk assessment. The first one is an understanding or doing a screening, which there is a slide in this pack. To understand, first of all, to start off with understanding contextual risk, which is country level risk, and secondly, regional or local level risk, because obviously this might be slightly different. And this could be done in the context of perhaps an impact assessment, or has a company done an impact assessment that captures these types of risks. It could also be done through various databases. It could be done through a number of different angles, but primarily focusing on third-party information. And then the second is the impact assessment, looking at how whether this has been captured in the impact assessment and how the project activities could exacerbate such types of risks. And then following on just to understand whether this is something that needs to be looked at more in depth through a dedicated gender GBVH risk assessment, which we do recommend in certain instances. For example, a large construction, a large project which is involving a large construction component, involving several hundred or a few thousand construction workers coming into a rural area, for example. So this would help zone in on specific issues that need to be understood better, and help in defining what specific measures that need to be put in place. And so, as part of the due diligence, these aspects would need to be looked at. Has the investor, has the company, has the project looked at this systematically? Where is it being covered? What is the contextual risk? Does it trigger further assessments that need to be done? Is the documentation sufficient? Or what is in the documentation sufficient? The paperwork is only part of it. Does the company or the project have the capacity to implement this thing in the right way? Do they need additional resources? What are these additional resources? And then the feedback loop, monitoring grievance mechanisms, how are they working? Do they capture these types of risks sufficiently? So, if a grievance mechanism doesn't say anything about it, doesn't mean that there is nothing happening on the ground. You have to look at it from the point of view is that does it allow for capture or for such certain things. So there's a number of different angles through which the due diligence needs to capture this aspect, so as to make the investor aware of what are the risks and what the company has in place or does not have in place.
Thanks, Niraj. That's very useful. I appreciate it. Any other questions? Okay, Niraj, I will share your contact details in the chat. So if there are other questions, people can email you directly if that's okay.
That's absolutely fine, Ben. I will share the presentation as well.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Pass it on to the participants.
Thanks, Niraj. Really appreciate you joining us today. Okay, final session, 4:30. Sorry, Alex, to put you in this difficult spot. But I hear that there's a video. I remember, when there's a video at school, how everyone got so excited. So I hope that we can have the same effect here.
Not a problem. We'll try. So, sorry, you said that I need to share also my audio?
Okay, yeah. So I think when it asks you to share content, optimize, it should allow you. It should allow you to share the audio. Although I'm no expert, but let's see what happens.
See what happens. Perfect.
Okay, so we can see your screen and your lovely background.
Okay. Perfect. And then we'll have my presentation coming up just now. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Bryn, and thank you everybody for staying online and paying attention. And thank you for the gender violence guidance. I think it's really important that that information gets out and shared. Even for those industries or companies that they don't use IFC, I think it's wonderful that that such tool it's out for everybody to access. Okay, so I'm Alexandra. I work at Community Insights Group. We are basically a social and human rights consultancy, global consultancy, and they're South African or Southern Africa based. And today I would like to present to you our latest product release, which is called Inga, Social Context Made Simpler. And Inga is an online social and human rights data reporting tool, which I would like to introduce to you in a short, brief video, because I would like to jump into maybe the use of this tool for particularly PS2. Just to continue with the examples and the case studies. Let me see if I can, there we go. So that's the first, it jumps to my slide 3. Let me just do this. Problem. Got that. Try again.
Select. Choose the indicators you need for over 300 selected indicators under 7 categories, all from credible and established sources. First, select a country. Second, choose the indicators you need from over 300 selected indicators under 7 categories, all from credible and established sources. The indicators cover a full range of issues that matter to people: health, security, human rights, environment, and more. Jump straight to those that are relevant to human rights or to the Sustainable Development Goals. Third, customize your report. Make it your own. Edit headings, change the order, and even compare the indicators against other countries or reference points. You can also decide the format of your report and include the logo and design of your organization. Do you need context reports for more than one country? Inga makes it easy. The personal dashboard allows you to quickly create, save, view, and edit previously saved reports, and even create different versions of your reports. Social and Human Rights Country Context Report. Simple, credible, updated. Ready to get started? inga.communityinsights.eu. Social context, simpler, Inga. Inga is an online...
Can everybody hear me again?
Yes, we can. Thanks, Alex.
Okay. And was the audio fine for everybody? Hope that
It's good
was
for me.
Okay, so
Okay.
basically Inga has been created to save your time. It will reduce bias and inconsistencies in reporting when looking for data and make informed decisions based on understanding the social and the human rights context. So basically what we did, we gather a lot of indicators that are necessary for due diligence, ESG governance, including a human rights due diligence or informed investments. We've gathered those key indicators for social and human rights context. And we have created this tool that will allow you in an instant to collect all this data for one country, 5 countries, all the countries of the world. So this will not replace your efforts, obviously, to go to the field and do your field work. All data needs to be verified as usual, but the idea is that Inga will give you all the data that you need so you can jump straight into your data analysis. So Inga gets data from different reputable global sources, such as the United Nations agencies, the World Bank, International Labour Organization, and we can name them. They're all available for you to check at the website. And the idea is that if you're a consultant or a lender, Inga will give you data that will help you in the screening and the scoping steps. And this will give you always national level context data, so issues that will influence project-related social and human rights. It will assist you in identifying at national level contextual issues to consider options, scenario planning, understanding what is the context where you're going to be developing your project. Identifying the need for additional studies. Perhaps in some countries you identify that perhaps gender violence it's a problem and you will need to deploy a specialist to understand how your business will need to cope with this. So the due diligence in assessing transaction risks and identifying opportunities for impact investments. So basically Inga will give you all those indicators that you need to consider. So what indicators are included in Inga? We're talking about 300 different indicators, and we've separated them for you in 7 categories. This is country snapshot, so you can have a nice country overview of the social and human rights situation, access to infrastructure and services, no discrimination, inequality, peace and security, community and their living environment, land, property and natural resources, and labor and working conditions. Basically what we've done, we've separated 45 subcategories, so it's made easier and simpler for you to find the information you're looking for. And also Inga has the ability to show you which indicators are related to human rights or to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So it will also help you, with the type of report you're writing, and the different information you're looking for. Maybe you just need to, select a few indicators. Maybe you don't need all 300. So Inga's there to help you just find what you're looking for. So I'm just going to jump straight into the example. So we're talking about labor and working conditions. So this is one of our categories, and the subcategories here are also related very much to PS2, child labor, employment status, equal opportunity and unfair treatment, forced labor, freedom of association, informal employment, leave, privacy, wages, working hours. So everything is included in Inga for all the countries of the world that we're reporting on. But it's also something important to say that some countries don't allow this information to be made public. So in some cases, some of the indicators might not provide you information, and it will be explained to you why not. So in this category, there are about 48 indicators to choose from, only for labor and working conditions. The information is provided on those more severe issues, such as child labor, forced labor, worse forms of child labor, and human trafficking. So Inga will be orientated to give you the data that you'd really need to consider as a high risk. The sources of information for this category include UNICEF, ILO, World Bank, Global Slavery Index, the ITUC Wage Indicator Foundation. So there's a lot of good sources of information, and it will also give you an idea how to measure and how to compare. If I'm choosing a country like Mozambique, South Africa, how do I measure? Is South Africa, how is it ranking? Is it on the bottom end, at the top? So I would like to show you how Inga can be incorporated to your work. So like you saw in your video, you need to choose your country you're going to be looking at. But we would like to make a point of choosing your indicators is very important so you can plan your report at the end. So there's many indicators to go through, many sources of information, and if you know what you're looking for, you'll find it. Inga will help you find it as well. Inga will give you an explanation of what the indicator means and how it needs to be measured. And basically, when you download your report, Inga will allow you to download a PDF or an Excel sheet, and it will also allow you to customize your report. So if you need to report first on labor conditions or in context, a country context, you organize your report as you need it before you print it at the end. So basically, I would like to show an example, and let me see if I can just zoom in here. So this is an example for Mozambique as well, and let's look at the living wages. So for a single adult, this is an INGA report for Mozambique, and it shows you that the living wage for a single adult monthly in local currency is 4,190 up to 7,800 meticais. And it will tell you what is the description of this indicator. So you can understand or make others understand what you're explaining with this number. What is the source and the period? When was this information collected? And what is the SDG goal that will be involved in this indicator? So you can look at the different ones, the typical family, also on a monthly, and then you can look at the minimum wage. So basically what you can see and hear that it's the wage indicator foundation, so it's all throughout the same source. And you can notice that the minimum wage in Mozambique, it's slightly lower than a single adult minimum wage. So perhaps, and at this point, let me do that. At this point, you would like to report on this, and perhaps it's important that you also have a look at a different indicator that will also help you understand this one. So Inga will also show you that in the socioeconomic development, Mozambique has most of its economy is based in agriculture. And employment, it shows high numbers of employment and also informal employment in agriculture. So you can see here, and also you can also see that the least developed countries are performing at this level. So that means for Mozambique that it's really not performing well. So again, let's go back to your report. What does this mean for your report? Do you only report on the wages, the minimum wage in Mozambique, it's so much meticais, or can we actually put it in context and say, well, you know, the minimum wage, it's so and so and so, but who earns these wages? Who is working in the economy? Where are they located? Are they urban? Are they rural? What is the informality of the employment in Mozambique? So the idea is that Inga will allow you very quickly to get the data that you need and focus your time on just reporting, doing your analysis, putting your effort to show your client, your project management, where is the importance about this risk? What risk are we talking about? So use your time to make sense of the data, understand the indicators on how it was calculated, interrelate the information. It's all there for you and accessible. You can go to the sources and check it yourself if you need to, or research even more. Decide how to report on it, because it's very important that you use your time to show your information correctly. And identify how would this data influence your project design. And I think that's very important for anybody making decisions. So the benefits will be that you can save time and you can reduce bias and inconsistencies, because you can support your client to make informed decisions with the latest information available. You can improve the quality of your impact assessment, because you will have all the indicators available to you at once. And advance human rights and people's well-being, which is what we are in our mission, and also to show respect for the rights of people and strengthen their resilience in the countries in where these investments are going to happen. So it's really an integral tool. It's accessible for anybody. It's really simple and easy to use. I welcome you to go have a look at the website. If you have any questions, you can definitely contact me. But I think it's a tool that will allow you to maybe explore beyond using your time on looking for the information, but actually to jump in on, you know, risk analysis, solutions, recommendations. So I'm actually just about to finish. So the membership plans are also available on the website for you to have a look at. There is an Inga free trial. You are welcome to come and try your free trial. It will have a limited access to the platform, and you can only access one country but at least it will give you the feel on how the platform works. And after that, you'll be prompted if you would like to buy the country report that you've been working on. The INGA Basic, so this is a one country report. It's costed at $950, which in rands today is about 16,000 rand. What we've considered that this is about 2 days of work for a senior consultant or a senior management in consulting, and it's worth the 2 days of work. So if you have to consider that you will get 300 indicators in any of the topics mentioned before, and also something to consider, this will give you have access to the report at this here, the unlimited user for 3 months period, and you can print out different reports. So let's say we buy Mozambique and you access the Mozambique, you can print all 300 indicators, or perhaps for this project, I only need to focus on gender violence or in wage, or I only need to look at country context. But in 2 months' time, I need to go back and look at the different indicators for the environment and perhaps community issues. So it's really an easy tool to go back and keep on printing the different reports that you need. And then we also have different packages for multiple countries or multiple users. So you're welcome to contact us anytime. If your company would like to invest in several countries, and this will be made available to you. So it's important that you budget for it in your next project, and you also need to consider the time that you'll be saving with something like INGA. So this is me. You can contact me anytime, and you're welcome to go and check on the website and explore INGA. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. That was fantastic. Does anyone have any questions? I have one, but I'd be curious to hear what others have to say. Okay, I'll be brave and go first.
Okay.
Alex, my question is, I think you've spoken in length about the sort of usage and functionality, but since its launch, how have you sort of found clients have used that information? What type of projects, considering that we've got many consultants on this call, how have they been using that info to provide a better service for their clients?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So that's a good question. So we've had clients using it from the GFI sector mostly. And it could be mostly called internal consultants if you would like to. So it's being used basically at due diligence stage so far. INGA has only been out in the market for about a month and a half. So, but the idea is that the INGA tool can help you at really early stages of the project. Any project, but also it can assist you in later stages when projects are sold or they need to come to closure, when most of the times we need to make hard decisions. So that's what it's being mostly used for at the moment. But like I said, it's only been very, very little time that INGA has been out in the market.
Yeah. Hi, Alex. Thanks for the presentation. This is Ibrahim from Nigeria. Mm-hmm. Very, very interesting tool. I just have a question on its reliability, degree of reliability. So has there been any peer review of the framework? And is there any statement on the degree of confidence that will apply to its outputs? Is there what's the quality assurance language that goes with, for example, the report is out? Well, what's the reliance language that typically would apply? What have you done to ensure that, for example, when the report says this is the average wage data in Mozambique, as you have presented, that is actually for Mozambique and not, say, for Nigeria. Thank you.
Okay, so let me see if I understood correct your question. Let me just go back to my example. Here, I'll just maybe focus there. So we haven't written the description ourselves, so this is not a description that we've made, neither a reference point that we've made. What we've done, we've collected the data straight from the source. So what you're looking at is what this source has provided as an understanding of this indicator, and what we've decided to show is what is the reference within this indicator. What is the highest, what is the lowest? So when you're looking at it at a regional level sometimes, or on an international level, but what you will be looking at is what the source has provided. So as developers, we haven't put in any input ourselves. This is what data can show you. If you go straight to the website, Google it, look at it, do a research, find this 2018 report, you will find exactly the same information. So the reliability is what you can trust the source. And that's basically the same with the Wage Indicator Foundation. You can go to their website and look at their ratings and their reliability and how they gather data. The Wage Indicator Foundation actually has an amazing way to explain you how they collect the data and how they analyze it and calculate it. So the idea for INGA is that there's no input from anybody else but the source where the information has been coming from. I hope I answered your question, Ibrahim. Okay.
Anybody else? Stony silence again. Okay. Guys, thank you very much, Alex. We really appreciate you taking the time to demonstrate the tool. I'm assuming your contact details are in your presentation and as well as in the calendar invite. Mm-hmm. Okay. So if people are interested, I guess they can either sign up through the website or by contacting you directly.
Perfect. Not a problem.
Cool. Okay. Well, after all the rushing, we're managing to wrap up 6 minutes early. Guys, my big request at the end of this is I'm going to put a quiz link in the bottom of this. It's really important for us to improve our training, to help us understand how we're doing, if we can improve and do anything better, that you please fill in this quiz. It will not have any sort of impact on you personally and how you're graded. We're not doing it like that. We just want to understand if we've managed to have an impact and make a difference in your work. So I'm going to share the link in the chat box now. And if you have the time, it would be greatly appreciated if you could complete the survey in the next 10 minutes. I don't think it will take more than 10 minutes to complete. I will also send it as an email to everyone along with the presentations, and then we can take it from there. If you have any questions, please email me or the presenters directly. We are going to hold similar sessions on PS3, 4, and 5 in September, October, and November. We would really appreciate you as consultants to speak. I mean, at the end of the day, we're trying to boost your skills, but also I think we have a tremendous amount of knowledge in this forum of consultants. So if you have ideas about how you could present your experiences on PS3, 4, and 5, please do contact me. We'd be absolutely delighted if we could learn from you. You guys are on the ground at the coalface, so it would be very valuable. And if you have ideas about how these sessions can be improved, I know doing it online is not ideal. It's hard to pay attention, but I hope we've made a small difference. Quiz is in the chat box, and if no one else has any questions, I think let's wrap up. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon, and hope everyone has a lovely evening and enjoys a glass of wine.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Ben. Cheers.
Thanks, Ben.
Cheers, Ben. Bye.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Cheers. Bye.